Today I'm making an Iron Man Mk1 mask. In a cave with a box of scraps! No, for real though, it's a box of scrap foam. Not to mention my shop's as cold as a cave. For this build, I used EVA foam, putty, paint, super glue, hot glue, cutting tools, sanding tools, safety gear, scissors, razor pens, and a box cutter. I started out by guessing, just eyeballing it with this basic shape that I thought, looked about right. Traced it onto foam. Once I refine this, I'll make a much cleaner template, which should be available to you in the video description down below. I weighted that down with a metal machinist block, but any weight will do, really. Then I traced that, then I cut it out with a razor pen, which I continually sharpened in order to keep the cut clean and uniform. I'm also being careful to make sure that my blade is angled perfectly straight up and down. This will prevent any ridges or depressions from forming in the foam after I join the two sides. I weighted the floor mats down with machinist blocks so the foam doesn't slide around while I'm working. And then I heated it up with my heat gun. I did this for a little while. The larger the piece of foam, the more you have to heat it up. In fact, it might be beneficial to just do one side at a time, but I was able to get away with doing this all at once. Then I formed it on a solid rounded shape. This is a failed resin project. It's just a complete monstrosity that's kind of become my foam smithing anvil. And I placed it inside a giant novelty Easter egg under some weights until it cooled. This will ensure that it retains its shape. Also, a metal mixing bowl will work. You know, whatever you happen to have on hand. Once it cooled, 18-ish minutes later, I removed it and glued the top points together with super glue. I also cut the corners off, forming this rounded cutout, and then I added eyes. I need them to match, so I made a template for that as well. I traced one eye on and then flipped it to make the other. Then I cut them out, and I saved the offcuts to make inset frames. Which you don't really need to do, it's just I think it looks a bit more accurate, a bit more intricate. You know, this is the sort of build you have a lot of leeway when it comes to quality, because it's pretty well established that he did not use precision tools to make it in the movie. And then it immediately goes through combat and takes a ton of damage. So this is actually a really good starter build if you've never done anything with foam before. I made those frames by cutting the middle out of the original eye hole offcuts, and then I re-glued them in slightly inset. Then I drew on the mouth vents and cut those out as well. They should be somewhat understated, just a subtle frown. Then I used my rotary tool to clean up some of the jagged spots around the edges, particularly in those rounded cutouts on the corners. These less than perfect cuts tend to happen when you try and make a cut after you heat form like I did, and that's the drawback to figuring out a project on the fly. Luckily, this is an easy fix with the rotary tool. However, if you don't have one, then the template should negate any need for the rotary tool. And there we have a basic Iron Man mask, but it's looking a little deformed, a little more like a Juggernaut helmet. So, you can use a bent up coat hanger to create some internal framework to help it hold in place and retain a more cylindrical shape. This arguably isn't necessary. You could put more work into heat forming, especially if you have a spare cardboard or PVC pipe that's the perfect diameter that you can just heat it up and stick it in. I was not quite so lucky, so I'm gonna give it a little bit of extra support. I used to do this a lot, make internal frames out of cardboard or foam core poster board, but those aren't the strongest materials, so you have to make the internal supports so big that they don't leave enough room for your head inside the mask, which is why I decided to go with coat hangers. I trimmed it down to size with side cutters. Then I stabilized the mask so that I could work on it without it moving around on me by arranging these machinist blocks like so. And I glued the wireframe in place with hot glue, one edge at a time. I also applied the glue to the inside of the mask first and then pressed the metal into it, because hot glue cools on metal much faster than on foam, so you run the risk of not getting a good hold if you apply the glue to the metal first. When the glue had solidified, the mask was able to hold its shape. Then I added a half-cylinder shaped bevel to the outer edge. Again, not necessary. It's the kind of detail that's so insignificant that you could get away with using thin strips of 4mm craft foam, but I already bought the bevel foam, so I might as well use it, you know? I cut notches at the corners to help it bend around them, and at the top I brought it forward a bit, forming a little rectangular alcove for the hinge. Then I continued down the other side and across the chin. I could have used the same material across the middle of the face, but that to me reads as a weld, as well as being a little bit thinner than the frame, so instead I traced a rough line across, and then I followed the line, more or less with hot glue. I didn't want the glue to bead up and start to drip at either end, so I timed it so that this glue gun would be barely warm enough when I applied it, and I did it pretty quickly. And then I set it in front of a box fan on low for a little bit, just to cool it down even faster. For the hinge on top, I cut some holes with a leather hole punch. Then I add a scrap metal hinge. I actually found a real hinge, just in my parts collection. My many boxes of scraps in a cave. And I held it in place with screws. Those are really more for show. You get away with gluing it on, but I had the screws, so why not use them, There's also a little bit of glue in there, just because, they're stuck into the hinge pretty well, but the mask part, that's just a tension fit. Then I covered up the seam in the forehead with some fast dry putty. I smoothed it out with a little bit of water. When it dried, I gave it a base coat of gloss black acrylic latex house paint. I actually did 4 layers of that so that it would come out extra shiny. See, the first couple layers always get absorbed into the foam, making it look flat and making the seam in the middle super obvious. And this is a lot of footage to time-lapse, so a little backstory about this project. This is a build I've been wanting to do for years, but just kind of got away from me, as many projects do, because there always seems to be something new coming out that everyone's hyped over. But the current hit shows are kind of lacking in new props and costumes. I think all the production designers are taking a day off. So I figured I'd work on something from my infinite list of builds I've been meaning to get around to. Not to mention that I've done a ton of Star Wars stuff lately. And the other day, Iron Man 1 was on, and I was like, oh yeah, I like Marvel too. So be sure to check back in 8 years when I finally get around to doing something from Lord of the Rings. Didn't I? Yeah, I definitely built a Frodo sword. Eventually I'll cover all the franchises. When it was dry, I shined it up with Rub and Buff metallic finish. This is less clean than an airbrush, or even rattle cans, like less even of a coat. But the unevenness and lack of complete coverage in the edges, where the frame and the weld are, will add to the dirty, soot-covered, built in a cave, been through a firefight look. It's called weathering. To any of the newbies out there, we're all there once, guys. Now, I'm not going to build the back of this helmet just because of the way that I'm going to display it, but if you do want to know how to build that as well, then you can check out any of my helmet builds, particularly the Among Us build, because that helmet is pretty basic. It's basically this, but without a face. And I'll include the back on the templates as well. And that's pretty much it. Now I can defeat Jeff Bridges. Thanks for watching, everybody. If you enjoyed this build, then you can subscribe and hit the bell icon to see upcoming builds. Because let's be honest, the subscribe button doesn't do what it used to. And if you actually want to get notified about upcoming builds, then you gotta hit that bell icon. Otherwise they'll be lost to the infinite scroll of your inbox. Be sure to leave a comment below to let me know what you'd like to see me make next. And lastly, I'd like to thank my patrons, the names scrolling by. These videos just wouldn't be possible without the support of my patrons. So if you enjoy these builds, want to see more of them, and want your build request to carry a bit more weight, then think about heading on over to the Patreon page, where you can enjoy ad-free early uploads. Thanks for watching, happy crafting, see you later.